This passage has a lot of hidden secrets buried within the impressions of the stories. First of all, I begin by saying I have had and still do have some distant relatives who have been incarcerated. I have a cousin who, back 30 years ago, deciding to take the life of his parents and uncle and aunt, but was successful in one situation. And then I have a nephew who's still spending up to 8 years behind bars. And so within this story, I think of family experience and personal experiences that I've had behind bars as I think upon these stories. So within the perplexity of the reading, there's this strange tale of a slave girl. She moves to become involved with the missionary efforts of Paul and Silas. And so Paul ends up in jail again. And Sarah Joby suggests that it's not the frequency of Paul being in jail so often, but it's the situation that we try to make him out as some kind of political prisoner, which he was not. And so she goes on to describe Paul's situation. She describes this imprisonment of Paul because he's someone who is poor, remembering he has to stop and make tents from time to time for his subsistence. He's someone who is homeless because he moves around to the large cities in Asia Minor, in establishing many, many congregations as a church planter. And he has an ethnicity that marks him within those occupied people under Rome. And so she suggests for our thinking that we are to look upon Paul as those who are overpoliced and those who are thrown in jail today. She's bold to make that recommendation. In this situation, these people could easily become discouraged, move into despair. I recall my pastor friend several years ago who went through a stroke and a heart attack, and in hospital. He could not say the words on his lips and tongue. He could think in his mind clearly, but he was almost mute until it came to remembering his favorite hymns. He could think about the verse, and he could move his tongue and his lips as he softly sang and recited the joys and blessings of the hymns he had memorized. It was a precious testimony for me to hear as he was eventually overcoming his despair and became a full-time pastor again. So here we have it. Acts 16 is a story about the freeing power that came with the worship of God at midnight. In this situation, the story is about the powers that be of the land. It is about the principalities of the air, which Paul often alludes to. And it is about economic interests, and it is clearly about prejudice. This story is filled with the power of God to move in unexpected ways. And yet it is about being imprisoned, even to the point of possibly being caught in despair. And so as I look upon these ideas, I am gleaning in my little analysis that there is a looking into some interlocking injustices as well as some justices as the story unfolds. And so, caught in the back rooms of this prison, I remember from my college days taking those sociology courses and anthropology courses where we traveled to the state prison in Stillwater, Minnesota. And as classes and several dozen students, we walked in the front door and were frisked. And then this large, massive bar gate opened up and we walked in a little bit more and were questioned and analyzed. And another large gate opened up and we went in a little bit more. Some more scrutiny and we went in a little bit more, and another big gate. And finally, 3 or 4 rooms deep, all barred off, we met with some select prisoners, and we as class members asked them about how they were doing, what happened that they ended up here, what were their now goals, how they were being treated, and what was the outcome of their hope to finally be released someday, and how did they evaluate their lives while they were in prison, all from sociology and anthropology study. And it was very enlightening for me to hear about how people saw their day and the possibility of renewal. And so in this text, it begins with this economic root system of a slave girl and the violence that are so explicitly described. Here we have, to start with, an unnamed slave girl. She tells the fortunes because she has this spirit of divination. And the story says that by her talent and skill, she's become a slave of men, wherein she brings in a great deal of money. And then she ends up noticing Paul and Silas, and she talks about them, which is technically true. She shouts out that they are slaves of the Most High God, who proclaims a way of salvation. And her words might have been useful to these apostles because she could very well have helped to draw a curious crowd for them. Well, finally, after days and days, Paul becomes annoyed and antagonized by her demonic shouting and harassing. And so he turns to exorcise her. And this exorcism of this young woman is the very first time recorded in the book of Acts. And it actively rejects that a woman is treated fairly when she's in bondage. And so she is set free from all this control and manipulation and use by her masters as she is exorcised from the Spirit. As the story unfolds, the slave girl owner began to realize that the bottom line is being affected. Their streams of revenue have been disrupted, so they go to the magistrates and they start to complain, and their complaint is completely unrelated to the beginning circumstance. instead of griping about revenue, they accused Paul and Silas of disturbing the peace. And then they go ahead and name them in a prejudiced way Jews from a culture of outside. So as outsiders, they are advocating customs that are unlawful for us folks who are Romans. So here we have this odd economic situation that comes nowhere within their complaint and their argument to the magistrates. And so we have a situation here that comes full circle in this being displayed. And it's a source I look to, who name is Sarah Joby, says there are at least 4 situations taking place. Sarah points out that this narrative leverages a certain cultural superiority by certain people. Secondly, they try to instill a social fear within these people who think their lives are being threatened financially. And third, there is this tremendous drive to preserve the economic system that they are into by overseeing the slave girl. And of course, fourth, they are bound, determined to keep the grounds of the status quo to themselves. So within the various layers, as I've mentioned before, we see what eventually happens is the torture and the beatings and the social isolation of people in prison within these powerful technologies of using the system wherein the mechanism continues to perpetuate itself and people are rarely renewed and changed for a better life following. So here we have the situation. Paul and Silas are not in prison because they are breaking the law. They are imprisoned because they are imprisonable people being taken advantage of by the higher-ups. They are vulnerable people. They are threatened because the bottom line for their way of life, for the powerful people, might get eroded. So as we continue to look at these steps and these interactions and these intrigues between the relationship of the various stories, there comes an unmasking of what's really taking place here, I feel. There is this moral posturing of this carceral system. The carceral system is that system within the prison itself. And that carceral system regulates human behavior in prisons 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The surveillance is perpetual. And so I would think that that kind of subversive system would be enough to take care of those in prison. But as we look a little deeper into the story, there is a more subtle, subversive thread taking place. Yes, there is this structural situation that's been introduced to us by the fortune teller's words, yes. She does describe Paul and Silas as slaves to God. But in her description, there's a question that's raised that hovers throughout the text. And as I see this question, I have to ask, just who is the captive and who is free? So looking a little more, the magistrates and the town populace They have the power to commit violence, and they use it. But at the same time, these folks are manipulated by the slaves owners who dangle them like a puppet on strings. This is to say that a few verses after the ones we read today, that Paul reveals that he is a Roman citizen. And in that relationship, there's a whole lot of fear that falls on these magistrates. And they have to respond within the shadow of Roman rule. And in that response, the circumstances change. There is a new definition of freedom in Philippi. Meaning, the powerful are now afraid. And the powerless have a lot more power than they ever supposed. So as the story continues, there is this inversion of these transactions that are taking place. And that happens between the jailer and the prisoners in the midnight hour. As the story tells us, there was this massive, massive earthquake. And the chains are rattled and shook up and moved, so torn apart so much that the prisoners are able to get away. And the jailer himself becomes very fearful of dishonor and death. This situation is very clearly described for us. It is tangible and it is looming. And so we have a jailer that's overwhelmed. And this jailer knows that he's accountable for every single prisoner. And if anyone escapes, well, his life is wasted. He becomes a subject of facing his own death. It's tit for tat. And the Roman government is going to use the vernacular, neutralize him. And he knows this. He knows the cruel, subtle, painful, sorrowful ways of the Roman legions putting someone to death. And at that point, he shouts out, desperate for his life, "What must I do to be saved?" It's death or life. And of course, as the story unfolds, he's ready to fall on his own sword as a quick, easy way out. Now we have Paul and Silas and the fellow prisoners still there, not running away. In every jailbreak I've ever heard of in my life, at least someone takes off, plays the hide-and-seek game, but they all stay. And here looms the golden opportunity within this story of violence and hurt and tragedy and earthquake and massive confusion. Paul and Silas are often given the golden opportunity to present the message of God's salvation. And beloved of God, before the night is finished, the meal is shared by all, their wounds are washed, and the jailer and his entire household are baptized. And we've got to know and expect there was rejoicing in heaven as well on earth for this miraculous experience. So we have here, I think in closing, the real potential to create a seismic shift in the situation. And Paul and Silas are brave enough, courageous enough to stay with the process. And they do make a seismic shift, because here in Philippi, the strongest and the best of the foundation of the early church begins. That also suggests to me that we need to be asking what this story says to the Church of Jesus Christ today. I think it's time that we spend a few moments moving away from imprisonment as a metaphor and think about imprisonment as something concrete. The concreteness of this story that I speak about can come alive today in the form of some questions that the church can address. And Drusilla Matson Neal refers to some of these questions, and I've changed them a bit for our time. 1. How does this story illuminate the carceral system found in the prisons and jails of our country today? What insights can we now understand? Or could we understand? I was so pleased several years ago to hear about the country of Germany taking prisoners who have committed murder through a process of evaluation and reorientation and education, and moving these prisoners into jobs, into stable societies, and after years and years of training and adjustment, releasing them to be solid, balanced citizens again. And at that time, our own state governor traveled twice to Germany to study their system. Let there be an application for us here in this state from their success in Germany. 2, how does our system today fuel fear and violence within prison and prisoners, even at the same time it promises to be a place of safety and order? What happens that any negativity would be perpetuated? And 3, moving a little closer in concreteness, how might the church today respond to people who have been newly released from prison? I have to say, in my own family, my own cousin, 4th or 5th generation, 4th or 5th cousin, after spending 20 years in prison, was released with an occupation of being an accountant. He couldn't manage it. No one came to his rescue. He lived alone. And after just a couple, 3 years, he took his own life. And now we may wait in our family for another young man in the next year or 2 who will be leaving prison. What will the church do for him in this adjustment to a new life? 4thly, how might you and I, the church today, outside of prison walls, better attend to the preaching and the singing and the praying within the carceral congregations, just waiting to be ministered to? And 5thly, how might you and I bound up the wounds? How might we share meals? How might we receive instruction for our own salvation? Beloved of God, this is our faith under the mercy. Amen.